Hey, welcome back to Lick Week videos. I've been thinking about some topics to cover in future videos, and I actually received an email from a Hangout member asking me about chord partials and how they're used. And I thought, wow, that'd be a great topic for the Lick of the Week, but maybe I've already covered it. So I went back to the archive of the Lick of the Week to try to find it. Couldn't find any Lick of the Week with that title in it, so I don't think I've covered this for some reason. But if I have, then, well, this will just be version 2. Not the same thing, but I don't think I've covered it. The term chord partials refers to what the name implies, using partial notes or partial positions out of a full-blown chord shape. So in Scruggs style banjo, you know, we're all familiar with the F, the D, and the bar chord, what I call the 1, the 2, and the 3 formations. And a lot of times in Scruggs style banjo, you will need the full chord to do certain things. And then there are times when you don't need all the notes, you only need some of the notes out of the chord, and that's where partials come into play. Now, I'll make a distinction here. Melodic players will often, you know, hold 2 or sometimes 3 notes on the fingerboard. But the partial positions that the melodic players are holding are partial scale pathways, or just a couple of notes out of a full-blown scale. Where Scruggs style is based on chords, not so much scale patterns. So let's talk about just the partial chord positions that we all recognize in bluegrass banjo as being Scruggs style positions, not melodic. That's something maybe for another topic. But so let's look at the Scruggs style partial positions in relation to the 3 major chord shapes. We'll break down each chord shape and investigate things that we hear and see bluegrass banjo players doing that are partial. Now I'm going to start today's video with the F-shaped chord. I'm going to zoom the camera in. What I'm going to do is break the F-shaped chord down into partial positions that we're familiar with and, you know, we can recognize. And if you've never done this before, this will be a great learning tool for getting some of those sounds that you hear traditional banjo players use. Now, the full-blown F-shaped G chord, I'll use G for the example. This is the full-blown G chord shape here at the 3rd and 5th fret. Now, there will be times when I only want or need a couple of notes out of the chords to get these traditional sounds and ideas for licks that other players do. So let's break it down into some useful chord partials. The 1st and 2nd string is a really common place for Scruggs style banjo players to use partial ideas. Now, one of the tunes that leaps to mind when I do this is Bluegrass Breakdown. So one of the opening phrases of Bluegrass Breakdown kind of plays around with this partial over an F shape. So I'm playing a G chord. I'm actually dropping back to G flat for Bluegrass Breakdown. But you see what I'm doing is I'm eliminating the strings that I don't need, because I'm only playing the 2nd and the 1st string in my roll pattern. You hear the 5th come in, but the 5th is open. So what happens is, if there's no reason to hold these notes because I'm not going to play them, then why do it, is one of the ideas, I guess, some of the logic behind a partial. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, John, why should I hold these fingers up in the air? Can't I just leave these fingers down and just not use those strings? Yeah, you can. The only thing you might get is a little of that squeaky sound, you know, which some people are bothered by that. Personally, that doesn't bother me too much. But if you didn't want to hear that squeak, then you could eliminate these fingers. One of the advantages of not having these 2 fingers down is that if you decided you wanted to add some notes to the partial, then having these 2 fingers available means you have more note options. Watch this. I can actually do a hammer on. So there's actually some pretty cool licks that may revolve around just holding these 2 strings. Even though you're not playing these 2 strings at all, you know, why hold them? Because leaving these 2 fingers available gives you more options. And because this is based on a movable chord shape, anywhere I move this chord means that I have the same partial ideas. As long as there are no open strings to sound funny. Then I can play the same licks using the same chord shape over any major key. So that's probably the most fundamental partial chord that you can use out of an F shape. This is one that most players are familiar with. Now another place to play partial positions out of an F shape chord is to play the first and third string together as a partial. I'm going to try to pull my other fingers out of the way so you can see this. So I'm only holding the third and the first. And I'm using the same fingers that I'm using out of the chord shape. But you know, sometimes players will modify what they do. Instead of having the pinky down here, they'll use the ring, or they'll do this. The whole idea of a partial is to get the sound you want with the least amount of work for the left hand. So if you feel like you want to change some fingers around, that's fine. If you want to use the same fingers that normally would be there anyway in the chord, you can do that. If it feels weird, you don't have to do it. Now what happens is the same rule applies. If I'm only going to play the first and the third strings, why should I hold the whole chord? So some players will pull fingers away or modify the shape, pull the other fingers away. Sometimes you'll hear tremolo played over this. Sometimes they'll do a roll. But whatever you do, you're focusing on a partial position or partial relationship. Only two notes out of the chord. And again, you could go back and say, well, John, wait a minute. If I'm only playing 1 and 3, why should I have to hold the other fingers up there? Couldn't I just play these two notes? Get the same sound, basically. Yeah, you can do that. It's all legal. But what you have to wrap your head around is, even though you may look like you're holding the whole shape, you're really only playing these two notes. So it is a partial idea you're playing, even though you don't have a partial shape on the fingerboard. So there's two ways of looking at this. You can just hold the partial shape itself and don't play any of the rest of the notes, or you can play the two notes and leave the other fingers down even though you're not using them. But either way you look at it, it's still, you're playing a partial position. Now you could continue with the F-shaped chord. You could play the third and the fourth string together. You could play the second and the third string together. So you have these different combinations of notes, and what you need to try and work out on your own is whenever you decide to play two notes out of a chord, or even three notes could be a partial. But most of the time in Scruggs style, the most commonly heard partials are based on two notes out of the chord instead of the full-blown chord. So you can try to use the same fingers that you would normally play to hold the chord to play your partial, or you could experiment and move fingers around, because using different fingers will give you different options for notes that you can add or take away. Some will be more logical, more ergonomically friendly than others. So you just have to experiment, try different fingerings for the same two notes and see what happens. But either way you slice this pie up, you're just playing, for the most part, two notes out of an established chord shape instead of the whole shape. So by playing around with that, you get some pretty cool ideas that can be played with an F-shaped chord. So that'll wrap this video up. Next week we'll look at the D-shaped chord and break it up into partials. I appreciate it. See you next video.